I want to welcome you to this first of our discussions in the Preaching Through Colossians course, and I'm joined today by my friend Tim Brokaw. I want to introduce him just for a minute. Tim and I have been friends since 1995 when we were both students at Emmanuel Christian Seminary. Tim has degrees from Milligan College or Milligan University as a BA, MED, so a Master of Education from ETSU, which is East Tennessee State University, and then an MDiv and a DMin, both from Emmanuel Christian Seminary. Also, Tim has been the minister at Midlands Christian Church in Lexington, South Carolina. That's in the southeastern United States since 1997. He's been married to Terry since 1993, and he has two daughters, Hannah born in 98 and Olivia born in the year 2000. And Tim and I really will be sharing with you several discussions. And as I've said in earlier lectures, just to break it up a little bit so you don't have to just listen to me talk and see me. And I think the interaction will help us as we go along. But this first one actually is a little different from the ones that will follow, because we'll be talking especially about insights into preaching and homiletics closely related to Colossians. But today we're going to think about resources for both studying preaching, so homiletics resources, and then resources for the process of preparing to preach. And we both brought a stack of books, and these are things we've accumulated over decades of preaching, but we want to highlight some things that would be most helpful. And I imagine several of these are available in the library at CACC, so maybe you can take a few notes and then check them out in the library. So we want to start out first with some books that we think would be helpful for preaching and learning to preach. Several of these books are books that we used when we were learning to preach, and some have been revised since then. But I'll let Tim start off. Tim, what are a couple of preaching books that you'd turn to?
Oh, well, Thomas Long, who was at Princeton and has retired, Witness of Preaching. It was actually the first book that we used at Emmanuel so it goes back to the mid to late 90s. And I met Thomas Long one time. Well, I met him in a hall as he was lecturing at Emmanuel, and I told him how much I appreciated the book, and he apologized for it. So I don't know how he feels about it, but I think it's a really strong introduction to preaching. And the thing I remembered about it, the whole theme of the witness of preaching, is that we are coming out of the audience as we share the word of God. And so we're listening as well as speaking it. And it reminds me of what John Killinger said about public reading of scripture, that we should read scripture as we're listening, not as we're writing it. And I think that it's kind of a similar theme with Long.
And I think and I guess I read it a couple of years ago. You've read his book on funerals, and I think we both thought that was pretty strong as well. And then this,
I've not read that book. It's on my purchase list. I heard him lecture at Emmanuel on funerals, and it was, I really would like to read his book, and I think it would certainly influence how I feel and think about funerals.
We've talked about, as I've introduced the class, and how one of the struggles that I have in teaching this is that we're talking about preaching and we're doing it cross-culturally. So I'm certainly not an expert in preaching in Southern Africa, and I don't know how something like that, a book on funerals, would transfer cross cultures, but I know it was helpful to me. Anyway, the first one I'd mention on preaching is one that
I would say that about all of our discussion today, in terms of my context versus the context of our friends in Central Africa.
Well, and I've said my guess is, and I don't know this to be true, but my guess is that the preaching text might be a little more difficult to translate over into a different culture than maybe some of the books on biblical studies. Not that there's not problems there, but it might be easier with those than some of the preaching, because preaching is different. But definitely. The first one I'd mention is from John Killinger. who was a preacher, and this was really the first book that I read on preaching. I read this at a class at Milligan, and it's called Fundamentals of Preaching, and it's exactly that. It's like if you started with no knowledge of how to put a sermon together, this would be a really good place to start, because he goes through the very basics, the ABCs of this is where you start and this is where you're headed. So to me, that was super helpful. What else you got?
Yeah, I would say about Killinger, I heard him as a preacher in the 1980s. Killinger had an earned doctorate in homiletics, as I remember right, and an earned doctorate in English from the University of Kentucky, English literature, I believe. And he was a gifted preacher. He was a Baptist, started out Baptist, ended up Presbyterian, and he was an outstanding preacher. If you get the opportunity to find him online, he's worth the listen. Probably the first book that I did not have it in class. I got it after I left Milligan in my wilderness wanderings before I entered the ministry 10 years after I left Milligan, the preaching ministry. I was a guidance counselor and basketball coach for a period of time, and that was a ministry as well. But then I entered preaching, started seminary 10 years after the fact. And sometime in that time period, this is The Art of Preaching in the 20th Century. The title is Between Two Worlds by the great English Anglican preacher, John R.W. Stott. Of course, Stott became well known. He retired when he was like 57 or 58, officially retired from his ministry, but then had a long ministry in evangelism. And I don't remember a lot about it, quite frankly, because it's 40 years old. But I know this whole idea that we're trying to bring the Bible, one world, and connect it to the world of people who are living day in and day out as believers was influential in my thinking. I know I read it, but I must not have made much marks back in those days. So, but I remember reading it and it being influential to me.
Another book that I have always really appreciated it is this Fred Craddock's book called Just Preaching. And Craddock is one of my favorite preachers. Taught at Candler School at Emory and was a homiletics professor for a very long time. He's from one of our schools, went to Johnson, that's for his undergraduate, but then went on and became a preacher among the disciples churches. But I could always listen to Craddock's sermon, and this is his approach. And it's been many years since I've read this, just as Tim was saying, but for me, this was the first book that I read that, preaching could be different from what I had grown up with. That was just always sort of basically 3 points in a poem, and that was it. That it might take a different form. It might look different, might feel different. You might come at it in a different way. And it's hard to, in just a few words, describe everything that Craddock says and his whole approach to preaching. It's called inductive preaching, but the point is he's not coming at it the way many of us probably are used to, and I think that can be refreshing. So that's one that maybe taking a little different direction.
Yeah, and I would say a couple things about Craddock. One, I got to hear him do a workshop in Newport, Tennessee, right, not far from Johnson, and he had preached there a long, long time ago when he was a student at Johnson. He's deceased.
Right.
But his PhD's New Testament. He was a New Testament professor, and he kind of backdoored almost into preaching. And he first became known in the mid to late 60s, I want to say, with his Beecher lectures at Yale University, which became Overhearing the Gospel. Does that sound right?
That's right. That's right.
Or something like that. And that was really his approach. Was inductive preaching is this sense of you're not just direct, right? And he was also dealing with people who his presupposition was that people knew the story or had been exposed to the story.
Right.
And we live in a very different world in our America, or it's becoming more so that. To add to Craddock, I'll segue with Eugene Lowry, the sermon. The subtitles, Dancing the Edge of Mystery. And Larry is very similar to Craddock in
Right.
some ways. And he develops the homiletical plot, one of the books on your reference list, which is this whole idea that the sermon really, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the sermon kind of parallels drama.
Yeah, that's right.
And the dramatic experience. So you have conflict and the thesis, antithesis, conflict, resolution of conflict. So he's wanting to develop this sense of tension and conflict in the sermon, and then bring it to resolution. Fair summary?
Yeah, I think so. And that's one that it took me a while to grab hold of, to understand what he was saying, because he talks about preaching as narrative or drama, story. There's different words he uses, but I mean, it's not that he's saying you just tell a story. It's that the sermon is structured sort of the way a story is structured, like Tim said, with conflict and thesis, antithesis, all these things. So that's again a different way of preaching, but something like Craddock.
And he summarizes with ah and aha.
Yeah.
And,
oh yeah. Right.
yeah, you
Forgot
remember
about that. Yeah.
that? So
maybe a more traditional approach is Haddon Robinson's biblical preaching. And I think this may have been a text for some of you along the way at Zimbabwe Christian College. I'm not sure about that. So if I'm incorrect, forgive me, but it seems like I've heard some guys who have talk about this book, and it really has become a classic. I think it's a standard textbook in a lot of homiletics classes. It was in one of my classes. And again, it's not as basic as the Killinger book, but boy, Robinson really does give you pretty much a step-by-step approach. And if I had to choose one or two, this would be one or two of the top ones that I would say you need to take a look at, because it really is a solid introduction to this is how you put a sermon together and this is how you deliver. I know you've read that one too, Tim. So what would you say?
I did. That's a big mint. It's not a chaw of tobacco. Which, if it was in the Southeast America, I would not be the first preacher to have a chaw of tobacco. But yeah. Well, what you said, Robinson's famous for the big idea.
Right.
That's his focus, the big idea. And if our students have used it, they know it better than I do. Again, I don't think I read it for a class. I think I read it in between classes or on my own. It was very influential. I agree with you. Diversity is good, but you better have a kind of sense of who you are and how to structure a basic sermon first.
Right.
And then you can diversify and even become more creative. But I agree. Among conservative colleges and seminaries, I'd say Robinson's still probably the number one homiletic text.
It's become the standard in some ways. And I had it when I was at Emmanuel. I mentioned in one of the other lectures that Bob Shannon was one of my teachers, and he used that book at that time. And I think it is solid. And I agree with exactly what Tim says. It's a great place to start. And then if you want to do some different things later, that's great. But this gives you a basic plan for this is the way to approach a sermon.
I would say Robinson is probably influential to me in terms of structuring a sermon. Craddock, I remember, and I meant to comment on this earlier, Craddock's book, he talks about that focus statement.
He does.
And that's been influential to me. I don't think it's much different than what Robinson is talking about.
I don't either. Right. And we are actually going to talk more about that in a lecture later on. And I mentioned it briefly in the lecture on Introduction to Preaching, of coming up with a main idea. You can call it a big idea. You can call it a focus. They're all at least in the same neighborhood. These different teachers of preaching might phrase it different, but I think we're talking about coming up with one point that we're really trying to communicate. And
Robinson's another guy, if you can find him on Preaching Today, or Larry Robinson, Craddock were all great preachers.
Right.
Um,
And there's YouTube
not
stuff
just
out
teachers
there.
of preachers.
So
Yeah.
one that's been influential for me, this is one Tim and I have debated about for over the years a lot, and that's Andy Stanley's book on, actually Lane Jones is on there too, Communicating for a Change. And in some ways there's some similarities because he's very big on coming up with the bottom line or the main idea, and his focus is on giving people tools to apply it and to make application from scripture. And he has a little different approach. It's not a traditional outline. It's really moving through a sense of where this is with the preacher, the people, creating tension with that. Then what does God say about it? Then the application, and to finish up. We'll talk about that one a little more in the course because it has been influential to me. But for all of these, I don't know that you go wrong with any of these approaches, and probably the best thing is to have a combination of them depending on the topic and the text that you're looking at. Have we left any of yours out, Tim?
I've brought some others, but I think those are the primary ones. I've got a couple others that I've read, but once again, I'm not sure I can remember much about them.
Right.
So
I want to spend a little more time talking about materials that are available, not just for Colossians, we'll come to that last, but for studying for preaching in general. So we'll sort of work through the more general things and then get down to the specifics on Colossians. So I brought several different things. And I guess what we should start with is when you're a student, funds are limited, and I know funds can remain limited. If you're a preacher, that's the way it is sometimes. And if you had to think, okay, right now, if I pull together a few dollars, I can buy one thing. If I could say the one thing that I would choose for you is a good quality study Bible, and there's not just one, there's probably several out there that would be worthwhile. One that I brought to the table is this one. It's the NIV Cultural Background Study Bible. We're going to talk about a few sister volumes that go with this, but it does give you a lot of information on the backgrounds, which I think is super helpful. We've talked about that being important in studying for preaching. So that's one. Tim and I were thinking about the NIV Study Bible, which has some updates, and both of us have an older version, but I think any of those would be really solid to have as a place to start, just because you've got comment on maybe not every verse in the Bible, but certainly some of the more tricky issues. You've got some of that introduction information that we talked about in the Introduction to Colossians lecture before each book. So you've got some thinking about authorship and date and audience and maybe the theology that stands there. I don't know, is there any others, Tim, that you would point to that would be of value? I mean, I know there are a bunch out there. Ooh.
yeah, that really, I would just piggyback, which is an American expression, on what you said about the Cultural Backgrounds Bible, which is that I found it on, I don't know if the students have access to Kindle. I'm not sure, but I found that Bible for Kindle, they were having a sale on it for $5 or $6.
Yeah.
Versus maybe $50 or $60. I don't think it's as easily accessible on Kindle. You have to click on
Right.
the number, and I've been reading through it as part of my devotional studies, and I have my Bible on my phone, and I have the Kindle so that I can read the text and then have the notes in both hands. I don't do that all the time, but I think my major point is, if they have access to Kindle or some other ebook, if you keep your eyes and ears open, sometimes you can get resources fairly
significantly
cheaply.
less. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that, I mean, I know a lot of the students use a phone and a smartphone, different things, and I don't know how much is available, for purchase in Zimbabwe, because I know it's different, but I don't know all the details, but it'd be worth looking into.
Yeah, and there's web pages that have similar
Oh yeah, right.
access to.
I mean, that's actually something I meant to include in my list and forgot it. I mean, the online resources are really pretty amazing now. The one I use the most is the Blue Letter Bible, because it gives you a lot of language resources. Plus it has, multiple translations that I use, and I just like the way you can cut and paste to put in other documents. What do you use, Tim? I don't even know.
I use BibleGateway.com, but they want you to do a membership
Oh, okay.
to access all their resources, which I've never done. I use it primarily just to have the scriptures in front of me, and it's the app I use on my phone. There's studylight.org that you pointed me to. I need to look. What's the blue version?
It's Blue Letter Bible.
Blue Letter Bible.
Maybe .org. I'm not sure.
Okay. I think I've seen it, but I've not used it much. I probably need to look at it. So there's also Olive Tree.
Yeah, and I've never used that. I've heard of it.
Which is an app. One other resource, it's actually a translation, but it's come out fairly recently. It's called the NET, the New English Translation, and it has multiple translation notes and even study notes. And it's not a study Bible per se, but they have a lot of helps.
And you actually mentioned that to me. I'm gonna reach over for this. There was some sales stuff a few weeks ago, and Tim emailed that to me, and I took a look, and I got there. I don't know what this version or what this edition is called. Let's see. Full Notes Edition.
Yeah.
But what is really good about it, they have notes going all the way through for the issues that the translators faced. And then why they made the decision they did to translate from the biblical language to English in the way that they chose, which I think is really helpful. It gives you some of the Greek without having to know a ton of Greek, but also what the big issues that come up in translation. So I think that's really good.
Well, they give you the words in the original and also transliteration forms,
which is nice. Yeah,
which is nice, especially since my Hebrew is pretty
mine's
shaky.
Terrible. Yeah, my Hebrew is not anything to brag about. Okay, since we're talking about languages, let's talk about that for just a minute. And sort of this is a bridge between the two topics we've just talked about. Probably the thing that I use most often when I'm in the New Testament is this NIV Greek and English New Testament. So I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but I'll try. So here's the first page of Colossians. So you've got the Greek text on one side and the NIV text on the other. So Greek on one side, English on the other. And my Greek is okay. Tim's Greek is better than mine. But to have those two across from each other, if I'm reading the English and I want to stay in the English, that's good. Some of you might know what an interlinear is. That's where you have Greek and English line by line. This keeps it separate enough that I don't feel distracted, but yet the Greek is right there if I want to look something up. So I found that to be extremely helpful and extremely accessible. And so whenever I'm in the New Testament, I'm using that. And I bet Tim will have some kind of recommendation on this. Didn't even get the right book. Hang on. Let's see. Where is the book I actually meant to get? It's right here. Here we go. Mounce's Complete Expository Dictionary of Old and New Testament Words. In some ways is a replacement for what some of you might have seen as Vine's Expository Dictionary. That's maybe a little bit dated in some ways. This is a newer one, but he gives you a lot of information on Greek and Hebrew words in a pretty accessible way. You don't have to know tons to be able to look this stuff up. And it's not too much information most of the time. So you don't have to spend forever looking through it. But if you're looking for something, Vines is still good. And I'm almost certain there's a Vines in the library at the college. So that would be a place to start if you don't have access to this other. Do you have a dictionary you use, Tim?
No, I really don't.
He just knows all the words already. So
well, I do and I don't. What I have is in one of my doctoral classes, rather than buy the Hebrew Bible, they allowed me to buy a online program, and I use it. And I'm not even sure. I've looked it up, tried and I don't even think it's available anymore.
Right.
But they're out there. Mine is called, gosh, I don't even remember what mine is called. Biblioly.
Okay.
And it has like the NRSV, and just, I tell you what, you want to, let me share my screen for a minute.
Yeah, do it.
All right, now let me find it. All right, there it is. Share. Can you see that?
Yep.
And let me see here. So this is just Genesis 1:1. I think it's the NRSV. In the beginning, when God created the heavens, the earth, you come up here, you can click on the original language text. And I've already said, I should have done a New Testament because my Hebrew is bad, but you can click on a word and it gives you the basic, and then you can show parsing, and it will tell you in this case, let me move that around. It gives you, this is a particle, conjunction, number 2, what is that, waha or something like that, and then verb, third person, masculine, singular. I don't even know, apocapated, apocapated, I don't even know what that is. And the stem is a qual. Again, all this is kind of missing on me. I had 1 year of Hebrew and want to revise it again. But let me see. So that just gives you an idea. I tell you what, let me do New Testament. We'll just do Matthew 1:1. All right. Again, the translation, you go under the link, original language text. Now these are all names, right? So let's go down to like 18, 19, I think, right? Joseph was a man, righteous, and wishing not, this is after Mary tells him she's pregnant, wishing not to expose. He, secretly, he went to put her away secretly, right? There's the her, there's the pronoun, right? Again, I did this totally off the cuff, so I hadn't reviewed it, but you can, all right, what's that word? Okay, well,
Can you move it up, Tim? Because we can only see, there you go, that's better.
Yeah. All right, can you see that?
Yeah.
I just hadn't clicked on it yet, and it was screened down. So this is the man, the noun, nominative, singular, masculine, an air, close that out. And then if you want more information, where am I? Yeah, I don't know what this funky box is doing there. Let me see, link. What? All right, well, that gives you an idea.
Right.
What I was going to say is it does have, let me do the original language text again. Let me come down here. That was my problem. All right. I showed you the parsing. You can also go under the analytical lexicon. My version, I haven't loaded it. When I've tried to transfer it from computer to computer, for some reason, it's not showing forms anymore. But it does give you can see bear, give birth, bring forth. And that's the Freiburg Analytical. There's the Laonida. It's not as comprehensive as what you've got. But that's what I've used over the years for almost 20 years now.
Yeah, okay.
Now you can get Logos.
Right.
If you're willing to like give up your first child or something. It's very expensive.
I've never done it because of that.
I suppose if I'd started 20 years ago, I might have, but it's always been too pricey for me.
Yeah.
But that's just an example of that one. I've not been able to update, but it's what I've used. And for the most part, it's been sufficient when I've been trying to get into the Greek and Hebrew.
And Blue Letter Bible does some of that. The problem that it has is because it's free, a lot of the resources that it uses are relatively dated. It's
Yeah.
not the most recent Greek text that, would be in this book and that we might have in a Nestle's text or, a UBS text. So even the language things are not as updated. So that's a disadvantage, but it's still there and it is free. So that's the nice thing about it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's touch on commentaries for a minute. About, I don't know, 25 years ago, or something like that, a friend of mine who happens to be on the other screen recommended this book.
Yeah.
And I bought it then. It's Craig Keener's Bible Background Commentary. In some ways, it's the basis for the study Bible that I mentioned before. Tim did recommend that to me, and I've used it many, many, many times. I mean, it's often the first commentary that I go to when I'm studying to preach or teach. And now there's an Old Testament volume too. There wasn't an Old Testament volume at that point, but it came out a few years later. I know Tim has recommended it to people because you did to me, but I've recommended it to people just because if you buy this, you've got the whole New Testament. You've got something on every book of the New Testament. It's not going to be detailed or super thorough, but it is there. And, it's hard to find that in a really helpful format, but I found that to be very helpful. I've given it as gifts to people as they're starting out in ministry or maybe teaching scripture. And I think it's an excellent resource to use.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
In some ways, it's not a commentary per se.
It's not. That's right.
Because it's background. It's dealing with background, but it's another step in beginning to understand the text,
right?
Especially the initial reading of the text,
right?
And when you go, oh, well, that must mean that. Well, no, in that context, in that cultural context, it cannot mean that. I would say if you have the cultural backgrounds Bible, you probably don't need to.
You wouldn't need both
money on that one.
I agree.
But yes, I used to tell people if you can only buy one commentary, buy that one.
And I've repeated that line. So
yeah.
But I think it's valuable. And you're right. It's not a commentary like an exegetical, quote unquote, commentary where you're going to go line by line and examine every word and things like that. But, the Bible background, the background stuff, the cultural stuff really is a big help because there are times when we just don't understand ancient culture. And that's one of those things that can help us get there.
Yeah. I will say this. My experience has been that there are areas in which our African friends understand the culture more innately than we Westerners.
Right.
Especially when you're talking about Old Testament.
Yeah.
The Old Testament and the Hebrew culture, the agricultural.
Yeah,
context.
Sure.
So,
okay, let's talk about.
Agree with that.
Unless you have anything else that's not specifically Colossians, do you have anything else you want to?
No, I mean, your Bible dictionaries,
sure,
which are on my shelf. I have the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology. It's 30 or 40 years old. Yep. Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible. Those are helpful in some ways. And I do have one evangelical commentary on the Bible. Were you able to see it when I pulled it?
I know it. You might bring it a little closer if you can.
Yeah, it's.
Yeah.
I don't think you're getting much more than if you get an NIV study Bible or a cultural backgrounds Bible, but it can be helpful. It can get you into the text and give you an idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Tim's right. There are a host of, I've used Harper's Bible Dictionary a good bit over the years, and there are several out there that I think are really good. Again, those are things you don't need 5 of. 1 of was usually sufficient. Yeah. All right, let's think about Colossians and some of the commentaries. And I think all of these are listed in your course outline that I mentioned. And I know Tim suggested one that I added as well. And so we'll just walk through them a little bit. The one that I've there's 2 that have been the most important for me as I've studied Colossians. The first is this one in the New International Commentary on the New Testament series. So there's a series that covers the whole New Testament. Actually, it covers Old and New. It's just called something different for the Old Testament. This one is by a New Testament scholar named Scott McKnight, who now teaches at Northern Seminary, that's here in Illinois. One of my favorite New Testament scholars, and this is a very helpful commentary. Pretty recent, came out in 2018, but it has been one that I've turned to over and over. It's a relatively detailed commentary on Colossians. So it's this whole volume is just on Colossians. A lot of times you'll find volumes on the prison epistles that'll cover several of them, but this one is just Colossians. I think McKnight is a solid scholar who loves the Bible, respects the Bible, is relatively conservative, but is open to a lot of different thinking and application of scripture. So that's one that I highly recommend. Tim, what you got?
Well, I'll follow up the one I mentioned because it's the one McKnight's replaced.
Yeah, right.
The New International Commentary on the New Testament by F.F. Bruce, who he's been gone 30 years, not over 30 years, 1990, I believe. Bruce, I think, has some kind of commentary on almost every book of the New Testament.
It would seem so,
with the possible exception of maybe not all the Gospels. But it's shorter. You can get through it more quickly than McKnight's because it is on 3 books: Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians. I don't know if it's still in print. I'd say you may have a shot at getting it in your library if you can find it. It seems to me like Erdman's may still be selling it as kind of what they call a classic edition.
I think they are, because I looked it up. I mean, it's been a couple years, but I looked it up, and they have reprinted some of those earlier New International Commentary on the New Testament volumes that have been replaced. They still have in print, just under a slightly different form.
Right. And
my guess is that one's in the library. I'd be shocked if it's not in the library at the college.
Right.
So.
And they've kept a lot of Bruce. Bruce is he's a wonderful writer.
Yep.
And it's 40 years old, but the background material is not going to change rapidly. Maybe what modern day scholarship is saying has changed, but a lot of the background information hasn't changed, and Bruce is spot on, and you can get through Bruce in about a third of the time as McKnight.
I think you find Bruce, whether it's this particular commentary or any of his others, just to be eminently readable. It is not out of reach for people without even a theological education or deep knowledge of Greek or whatever. He speaks in a way that I think most of us can understand him, and I think Tim will agree that his Acts commentary is still one of the classics on Acts. I mean, there's a ton more that have been written since then, but it's still really a fine commentary on Acts, and another one that's probably in the library there.
I have a hard time. If I have Bruce on my shelf, I go to him.
Yeah, right. Another one that's been important for me, and this one's much shorter, but important for me in this series, is N.T. Wright's Tyndale commentary. And it's been around a while. Wright is still very active, and he has a lot of stuff online right now. If you look up N.T. Wright on YouTube, you will find plenty to watch. There's stuff that came out this week, as a matter of fact, not on Colossians, but on other topics that are related to the New Testament. But this is one of his earlier books. This is 86. But again, really easy to get through because you're looking at a pretty small book, and this is Colossians and Philemon. He and McKnight come at it in a very similar way. So I think, the McKnight's going to be significantly more expensive because it's a bigger hardback book. This is probably significantly cheaper. So that's a good way to go if you're looking for one volume. Wright has written, I don't know how many books. I think I heard at least 70 recently, which seems realistic because there's so many books of his. I've read a lot of his books, and there's dozens I haven't read. Along with that one, let me just mention, he's got this series that he covers the whole New Testament in. John Goldingay covers the whole Old Testament in the same series. But this is very much for the popular reader, the everyday churchman who can take a look at a passage of scripture and wants to know something about it. Wright's written something for every book of the New Testament on that. And then, as I mentioned, listening to Wright's lectures and then reading some other things was the reason I jumped into Colossians, and was sort of the genesis for this whole class, is what he says about, especially Colossians 1:15-20, and what that says about Jesus. So that work has been really important for me. What else you got, Tim?
The only thing, yeah, I got a newer edition when we were
There you
going to
go,
preach on
yeah.
Colossians, but they've just now replaced Wright in the
That's right,
series
you told me
as
that.
of this month.
Yeah.
And I don't remember now who's got it, but
Was
so
that a revised edition or just a reprint? Do you know?
it wasn't just, let me see what they called it. That's a good question. I think it must have just been a reprint.
Okay.
2006, originally published 1986.
Yeah, and that's what I've got.
Yeah. Although I'm thinking there's a couple places where he may have updated it a little bit, but I think it's primarily a reprint.
Okay.
Word Biblical Commentary. Do you have that on the reference?
No, I do. Oh, I don't. Who is it?
It's Peter T. O'Brien, who
Oh.
whenever his name comes up, there's
we talked about that. Yeah.
there's issues of plagiarism noted, but James and I have talked. I think it's primarily a failure to cite proper bibliographically. It's been around again 40 years, and it's I bought it in April of '86, so I was 12 at the time. But some people don't. Let me say something about the word commentary.
Yeah.
The word commentary is, they give you introduction, and then they have form, structure, and setting. You probably can't see that. Form, structure, and setting as one part. And honestly, unless you're doing PhD work, I don't know, you can skim it or skip it, I think, most of the time. And then they go into comment, which is verse by verse comment. And then for the section, they normally have, well, he's got an excursus, which is throwing me off. What do they call that last part? Explanation.
Yeah.
So there are people who comment that it's hard to read. I've never found that to be the case, because I think you just get, I always focus on the commentary, and if I can do the explanation, fine.
Right.
That is the way I've generally handled the word. But most of them, the explanation is very short. I think James D.G. Dunn in Romans, his explanations as long as his comment. But
yeah,
you can get to it if you just go to, if you're time crunch, you can find it in the library, go to the explanation. It will at least help you make some sense of this one commentator's comment.
Now you added Thompson, right?
I did, which is on my Kindle.
Oh, okay. So you can't show it to us.
Can't show it, but it's I sent you a quote today.
Yeah, you did, and I'll probably include that somewhere along the way, so they'll hear that. But I do not have them, but it looks like a very fine work from the things that Tim has referred to so far.
The whole idea of Two Horizons is they have kind of the individual commentary and then the theological concerns.
Okay.
That's the idea. I'll real quickly, here's series that have been around forever. The Expositor's Bible Commentary. Again, it's a I think originally it came out in 12 volumes, including one that was introductory. So it's a much shorter approach to most biblical books. They've revised it a couple times. There's some abridged editions of it out, which I think eliminates a lot of the notes.
Yeah.
Okay. And I won't show you that one. Communicator's Commentary. Although I found Maxie Dunham on Colossians helpful. And then there's the Bible Speaks Today series, which came out mostly in the 80s and 90s. IVP prints them in America, and I should know who prints them in England, and I don't off the top of my head. Oh, it gives both an England and United States address. Some of them, John Stott was the general editor. Anything by Stott in the series is pretty good, in my
Right.
opinion. But they can take you as long to get through. They're commentaries, but they're not very technical commentaries. They're more homiletical. And sometimes, by the nature of being preachers, they can be a little wordy and harder to get through a passage than maybe another briefer commentary.
Imagine.
Some are really good, some aren't as good. That's my opinion. I think the one on Colossians was pretty good. The one on Genesis, I think, is very good. The one on I've always liked the one on the Gospel of Mark.
Okay. Was that Stott or was that somebody else?
No, that's a guy named English. Donald
Yeah,
English, I think was his name. Yeah.
One last one from the New Testament Library series, and this is Jerry Sumney, and I heard him lecture a little bit at the North American Christian Convention, which you may have heard of, is no more, but it was our convention here in the States and I guess in Canada too, since it was North American. But anyway, he's a very fine New Testament scholar from the Disciples. He teaches at Lexington Theological Seminary. This is a good commentary. It's from a viewpoint that's frankly more liberal, a little further than we probably are, but yet I think it's got some really good insights and is pretty helpful. It's a solid series with some really fine volumes in it too, but Sumney is a good scholar. Okay, I think we're through my whole pile here. Any parting shots, Tim, before we finish this up?
Well, this may go to the next lecture, but it struck me that at the very end of McKnight's introduction, he spends about 8 or 10 pages showing how different commentaries outline Colossians.
Yeah, he does. That's right.
And that's probably goes more to when we start talking about structure, but it's very helpful.
Yeah, so he spends
you can get your hands
more on that than you would normally see, I think. I don't know that I've seen that before.
Yeah.
So anyway.
All right.
Okay, well then we'll finish this up and we'll have several of these discussions along the way. And the next one will be more about how to preach a section of Colossians. So thanks for listening.